Yes, it says live.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFest X. We are joined by Mr. Raza Rumi from the United States currently, but Raza is a Pakistani policy analyst. He's a journalist and an author. He has been an editor of the Friday Times, which is Pakistan's foremost liberal weekly paper. He has also worked in broadcast media as a leading commentator and was also the director at the Jinnah Institute, which is a public policy think tank. His recent book, Delhi by Heart, was published by HarperCollins, and he's currently based in the US after an assassination attempt in 2014 that actually killed his car driver. Raza teaches at Ithaca College in the United States and is also a visiting fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy, Washington, D.C., and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at the Georgetown University. Raza, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Raza, you mentioned in your book, Delhi by Heart, that, how is it that certain countries or cities, the capital of one country feels like your own? And clearly, in the context of Delhi, whilst India, Pakistan obviously have had a shared history, um, there is always this sort of ingoing fight about the similarities and still the differences between the two countries, and hence the capitals and the cities as well. So in your research and travels, uh, did you find more similarities or differences?
Yeah, I think I found them both, but obviously the similarities are far greater and far more formidable because they're rooted in a sense of history. And that is why, I got down to writing this book because I was so inspired by what I saw in Delhi and particularly its sort of history and its last 800-900 years of history. Because the whole idea of this Indo-Muslim identity. I mean, it's so much linked to Delhi and the way various cultures, religions, and came together and turned into a more composite culture. Now it's under threat, as you know. Both in Pakistan, we do not want to acknowledge our past, and India is the enemy, and in India, you also have so many voices that say Muslims were these cruel, barbaric invaders, and it's time to avenge them, or it's time to isolate them. So these are all false narratives because 800-900 years of history entails both the high points and the low points. It's human beings after all, and in particular, what went among the people, people who came from Central Asia or Persia, and those who already lived in India, and how they interacted and how they, it was very beautiful age in so many ways. The whole Sikh movement was born out of that. The Bhakti movement was born out of that. The facets of Sufi Islam, because here the South Asian Islam is an indigenous South Asian Islam. It's not like the Arab version of Islam, or it's not the African version. It's a very peculiar, mode of worship, of course, with all the basic Islamic ideas, but very much rooted in the soil, in the folklore, in the history and context of India and South Asia at large, if you want to add Bangladesh, etc. So that is where I the book says that it's not an unfamiliar or an unknown territory, because it is very much part of our history. That's what I was exploring, actually.
Right. And so, what were, if I can say, the discoveries, which you have tried to depict, through this book? Clearly, of course, I'm sure you would have traveled to Delhi even before, but for the book, what are those specific areas that you very strongly are highlighting?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are many areas. I mean, it's a part travel writing, part memoir, part sort of history. It's a mishmash. So I mean, I'm not really sure there are discoveries in the journalistic sense at all. But I think what is obvious, I'll put it in another way, yeah, that things that are very much central to, say, the North Indian and or the Pakistani kind of cultural identity, like the music, for example. Qawwali itself emanated at the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia, and then Qawwali over the centuries has influenced so many other musical native forms, and even Hindustani classical music that we have now imbibe some of those. Even Bollywood or the songs composed in Pakistan have Qawwali's bol or its particular intonations embedded in them. So that and because that was in Delhi, and one met a few kawals and went to the dargah, so that you can call it a discovery. But also cuisine, for example, and that's what I focus on. The food that is now sold across the world as Indian cuisine is actually a kind of a mix again, because the naan that we eat, or the kebabs, or other varieties, even paneer, as I discovered, I was researching. Now paneer is a vegetarian sort of popular meal, but the Persian technique of creating cheese, that is how it came. It came during that era, and now because it's vegetarian, so the Hindu Indians, those who are vegetarians, some are not, will have adopted that as their kind of favorite meal. So but it's all so blurred, and that is the most fascinating part. It's not so much about discoveries, it's just the fluidity of our historical experience and our present, which is what is most fascinating.
And you brought about food and cuisine. I think that's a very important aspect because clearly, I think the shared cuisine between India, Pakistan, and even Bangladesh,
Yes,
to the Western palate, it is almost always presented as Indian food. So
yes.
I'm sure, I mean, you're living in the US, you know, uh, all across the US and UK, you'll find dozens and dozens of good so-called Indian restaurants, but they are actually, run by Bangladeshi cooks and chefs, and a lot
Even
of the
Pakistan.
flavors are Bangladeshi and Pakistani.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I'm trying to say. That it is these are very very important markers. We undermine them because they're not as sensational as, say, the nukes, or the tanks, or the submarines, or the statements that politicians fire at each other, or the ghastly incidents of terrorism. That's also true. That has since Mumbai, those heinous attacks. Obviously, perceptions have altered in India, because I've been coming after that, and I've met so many people and talked to them. But the reality is that all of these horrible political or power centric incidents do not take away from the cultural history that we share, and that is a very very important aspect. And I think it needs to be said again and again, and reminded, particularly for so many young people. Pakistan is two-thirds of Pakistanis are below the age of 30. In fact, very soon it'll be about 70% of the total population. Now you can imagine what kind of it's a totally young country. Same in India, the youth bulge is growing. It's almost 50% or more, and in Bangladesh as well. So for these young men and women, it is very important that they must not get trapped into the current discourses and the manufactured histories that we have created, both in India and Pakistan, by the way.
True. No, absolutely right. You know, um, let's just go back to 2014 and some of those unfortunate incidents which sort of took place with you. Um, clearly, I mean, if if you look at India, Pakistan, and even Bangladesh, we all have a shared history. We're all democracies. Um, in a, and we are all now in an environment where free speech is under considerable threat, whether it is by individual actors, whether it is by private actors, whether it is sometimes by state created actions. But certainly there is an issue in the Indian subcontinent where the top democracies, which should have free speech at the core foundation, are now stifling it in some form or the other. If you look at the incident with the bloggers in Bangladesh, or with writers in India, in Pakistan, you've got similar incidents. Where do you see this really going, and what is your sense, having really been at the receiving end?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it is a huge threat. And somehow, we all think that in Pakistan has a functional democracy for the last 7, 8 years now, before there was Musharraf's military rule. And there's a cyclical, unlike India, India has had a more stable and a more strong democracy. But, democracy by just having parliaments, elections, and elected officials is not enough. At the core of it, are two or three things. First is the fact that the idea of equal citizenship, that all citizens, regardless of their caste, creed, color, faith, gender, are equal before the law and have a sense of participation in the political life. And then other media freedoms. Or if you really want to pin down within that, is the freedom of expression, of having the space and liberty to defer, to dissent, to disagree. And that has been, in Pakistan, we've had a long history of muzzling, because we've had long military dictatorships in which the norm was to suppress dissent and suppress, the alternate voices. India was not. I mean, it was not as bad as it is now. I mean, in the stories one reads from the press. But surely, what is happening now, with the murders of writers and intellectuals, and threats and harassment of journalists, it is certainly not a very, very healthy development, and it does leave a question mark on what is fundamentally wrong. And I think I can pinpoint my thesis on that is that the British left India in 1947, but they left physically, but left a whole state apparatus, which is very colonial, which is very, very extractive, which is repressive. So, and it's true and valid for both India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The bureaucrats rule everywhere, unelected bureaucrats, at the local level, at the central ministries, at the state levels. And they are basically that the ethos of that colonial state structure is towards repression. Now, see, just by the idea that in India the police is governed by the Colonial Police Act of 1861. In Pakistan as well, it was changed. Musharraf tried to amend that, and so for a little while some changes were made, and then it has now reverted to the default position. In Bangladesh, the same. Now imagine in 2015, these three independent states used a colonial instrument that was kept to, sort of created to keep the natives, quote unquote, in check, and muzzle sort of any dissent or opposition to the state. So here, the culture is in our countries is that you have an alternative view. You are either anti-government, anti-state. In Pakistan, it's usually anti-state. Anything you want to say about the foreign policy, or the fact that let's do something on terrorism, or let's normalize with India, you are anti-military. And military is so central to the idea of statehood in Pakistan, because of all its checkered history. And in India, I'm seeing these whole signs that, if you are critical of the ruling party, then obviously you are critical of Indian, nationalism, or the democracy. And this is a very, very worrying trend. And this rise of religious extremism is also in evidence in Bangladesh, where we've seen so many bloggers being hacked to death in a most merciless and brutal fashion, and so many others are running to save their lives, because the Islamist groups have issued lists of people, and imagine they're not even in print, they're not even on TV. The reason I was attacked, largely was the fact that my face was on TV for long hours every evening, and people could identify whoever they were, Islamic extremists and their handlers. They could see it, and obviously TV is mass media, but internet or blogs still require a basic level of literacy. Not everybody accesses them, so it just shows that the space is shrinking, and that space has to be reclaimed. And I'm so proud and so sort of inspired by the act of Indian writers to express their dissent by returning their awards. Whatever political furore it has caused is secondary to the very act of a writer staying true to his or her conscience, because the writers are not political activists or party workers of any kind. They are hostages of their own conscience, at the end of the day.
So, you mentioned something very interesting, that a lot of this has to do with our colonial past, the shared colonial past. And but clearly over the last 6 decades or so, uh, all these three countries have then gone in their own directions in terms of governance, administration. Like you mentioned, with Pakistan, it's been slightly different. With India, it's been, of the three, India has been far more democratic, far more transparent, far more open. And we've only had some periods here and there where we've had such incidents. But what is it now, do you think, that, in the Indian subcontinent, where suddenly in the recent past there has been this resurgence of intolerance, resurgence of hate crimes, resurgence of this absolute sort of muzzling of any voices of dissent, any alternative voices. And clearly, if you see, it's almost in the last 6 to 9 months that we have seen in all three countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should I'll tell you that definitely it is on the rise. And in Pakistan, the issue is that we perfected it to a kind of a degree where intolerance and extremism, sponsoring ideas and laws became part of Pakistani, governance structure under Ziaul Haq. Because he completely altered the way Pakistani institutions functioned, the way he amended the constitution, amended the laws, brought in these really, really medieval interpretations of Islamic jurisprudence, and crazy things like women having half the testimony to that of men, and brutal punishments, introduced on the statute, and then the blasphemy law, which has been the core. The numbers have been going up, and beef debate in India reminds me of that. Lynching of a man suspected to have eaten or kept beef in his fridge is totally identifiable for us Pakistanis, because we have crazy mobs who go and lynch a Christian or a non-Muslim or a Hindu or an Ahmadi sect in within Pakistan, just for this on the suspicion of a blasphemous remark or act. And this I'll tell you something. This has to do with the state patronage, or the state's ability to create that level playing field. for all its citizens, as I said earlier. And in India, let's not forget that the 1980s, riots against Sikhs were really tragic, and the problem is that a lot of them remain unpunished. I've touched that in my book as well, because it was about Delhi, and there was carnage in 1984. So I met a few people who were victims of that, and I've tried to cover it. So I think what we have done is that we have in the region we don't resolve issues. So the bloodletting of 1947, with 1 million+ people dead and millions and millions dislocated, is still not resolved, or still not healed. It's an open wound. The Sikhs. What happened to them after Indira Gandhi's assassination is again an open wound on the body politic, and the state has not been able to fully punish all those people. So until you don't do that, these things then emerge. And now there's a new sort of whole ideological matrix that we see, in which, and as I said earlier, the driving force behind that is the idea that in the past there was injustice against Hindus by the Muslims, and in Pakistan it is just the mirror image, because we justify our creation in our textbooks, and what we learned at school from our parents, from our elder generations, was that we were going to be maltreated by the Hindu majority, and therefore we had to have a separate country. Now check out the stories; they are identical. Just replace, like the functions you have in Microsoft Word, edit and replace. So Hindu becomes Muslim and Muslim becomes Hindu. So it is, and all of this is rooted in the fact that the British actually created all these communal identities. The term Hindu itself, you do not find it in historical texts, as so many other historians have noted, before the British era, because when the British had to do their census, they had to do their various gazetteers, their official documents, their intelligence work, they had to identify you as someone. So, and Hinduism is so diverse, so complex. I'm not like a specialist, but I always get boggled, because I've been to Calcutta, I've been to South, and the variety and the richness of belief systems, or even gods and goddesses, baffles you, because there's no linearity over there. Okay, in Islam, you can say that Muslims all pray whatever 5 times, or have one single god, or so. But even then, the sects make it so complex. The Shias and the Sunnis, and within Sunni so many subsects, and the Sufis, and the rationalist Muslims, and the extremist Muslims. So you have all kinds of shades. So these monoliths were reduced to singular identities, and we have actually imbibed them, as post-colonial creatures. And now we are carrying out successfully the colonial agenda, even after 170 or 80 years of it all. And it's time that we need to grow up and think of our past and reimagine it, and reimagine our futures. Because if we are locked into this Hindu versus Muslim, and India versus Pakistan, and religious battles, and perceived real and perceived injustices, it's a totally lost cause. Because look, in India you have 13-14% Muslims. In Pakistan you have 5% non-Muslims. In Bangladesh you have a huge Hindu population. Okay, and what are these 3 countries going to do? I mean, purge all these non majorities groups, or what? Or would they actually work towards more inclusive systems of governance? And I think that is where the function of writers and function of literature, and in particular mass media, is very important, because mass media has come as another inheritor of that whole communal divide, because such news sell, and corporate media is very happy to sell either jingoism, or lynching stories, or wild statements from politicians, either in all 3 countries, not just in India. And in Pakistan it's the same. I mean, for example, I'll give in Pakistan, the media would not mention for years that the Shia Muslims were being targeted, because with the rise of violent militias. And only in recent years, more reporting was done. And when I was on TV in Pakistan, that was one of the reasons why the people who've been arrested, affiliates of the Pakistani Taliban, and they said that he was pro-Shia, or maybe he's a Shia or an Ahmadi, which according to their ideology is being an apostate. It is almost the same as that extremist mob going and killing akhlaq, thinking that akhlaq has blasphemed against their religion. So do you see how the narrative is just the same? It's that of hate, exclusion, and violence, and state has the central role there to clamp it down. And unfortunately, until the Indian state, and in particular Mr. Modi, who is this really powerful and image of new rising India, whom a lot of middle class Indians see hope in for economic transformation and India's improved future. I mean, he also has to think about these things.
Certainly. And Raza, you really sort of articulated, it very well in terms of how the post-colonial era has left us with this self-image and also the image of our, brothers. Having now been in the US for some time, and whilst you still interact and work in a variety of areas with the Pakistani media and your teaching, etc. With a little bit of distance, is that giving you a different vantage point to say, well, really what's going on, and what else is the world thinking about such incidents, and free speech and freedom of expression in this area, between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh?
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 things you mentioned. First, of course, I think the distance obviously alters your perspective. And, it's been more than a year now. And I do feel that, looking at it from afar, it does, well, first of all, it appears really crazy because, not that hate crimes don't happen elsewhere. In the US, for example, as I'm knowing more and more about this society, the way the African American community has been targeted by the police, and the profiling that goes along, even Islamophobia, which is the rising tide across the globe, and not just in the US but in Europe, and to some degree in India as well. And you reflect about these things. But certainly, I can tell you that the kind of shock and horror that has come about in the wake of these murders of bloggers in Bangladesh, and these writers in India, and of course Pakistan has always, for the last 10 years, has been in the spotlight for terrorism and on all the rise of extremism. But each incident, of blasphemy, or a blasphemy victim being maltreated, does leave a very, very disturbing impression of our region. And the pity is that South Asian region, I mean, look at South Asians abroad. I mean, in the US, for example, I mean, you have Indians in NASA, you have Pakistanis in Silicon Valley, the academia here is full of Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshi professors, and who are like the top-notch thinkers, and what happens? These people, when they go out, they're really and even our labor in Gulf, I mean, it's the best labor, sought after labor. So what happens to this lot when they live in their own country, in their own iniquitous structures, and they behave in a different way, and their potential is underutilized, and once they are out of their countries, in different environments, they really flourish. And so I think that is what we need to really reflect about. How do we have to now refashion our societies, whether it is the sectarianism in Pakistan, which has taken a violent turn, or is it the way the Dalits are imagined and perceived in India, or the way the minority groups are being viewed in Bangladesh? And let me also tell you about Bangladesh, that while I'm a secularist myself and I support what Hasina Wajid has been doing to tailor the constitution and improve it, but the kind of hangings that have, in the name of, retribution for war crimes has also been excessive. Human rights groups have really objected to the way those trials have been bulldozed, and that does not that these fissures and create permanent scars on a society. And they have to be immediately, either I mean, of course, they have to be avoided to begin with. But if these, uh, sort of incidents do occur, then states have to work towards mending them, towards finding some sort of healing. I mean, look at Germany, which went through the most traumatic experience, the Second World War. They have come a long way. I mean, whether it is the education system, whether it's climate change, whether it's about amity and more tolerance and more openness, they've really strived hard to change and overcome their very, very dark past, the whole Nazi business and, gas chambers and concentration camps. So I think the EU again is a great model for our region. I mean, they killed each other like nobody is business. Millions and millions of Europeans were killed in the two world wars. And see today, after 50, 60 years, they also realized that was a very, very counterproductive phase of their history. So we also have to think about that. And I don't see it happening anytime soon. Our governments and our military in Pakistan, I mean, I don't think they are really committed to peace, and frankly, even BJP does not seem interested. So that may be so, but independent writers and media professionals, civil society, youth movements, they have to keep on emphasizing that these are important steps for our future. So whether the current government in any of the country likes it or not, we have to keep on saying what is right.
True. Very true, Raza. And, thank you so much for joining us on LitFest X. I think, it is this use of technology which has enabled us to be in conversation with you. I think, it really is a pleasure that you are, journalist from Pakistan who's done tremendous work there. You are now in the US, and you're talking to a global audience with an organizer from Mumbai. So we can't get more liberal. We can't get, more free than that.
Truly. No. I think it's fascinating. I wanted to actually say this at the start that what you're doing is truly a new age stuff, and because the world is shaping. Being in the US, you realize how important the digital is. Because I don't watch the TV here for a year. I think twice I've put it on. I always do it online. I've stopped buying hard copies of papers. I subscribe to them online. And let me also tell you that because I'm still a consulting editor at my newspaper in Pakistan, and of course I have to commission stories every week. But technology has really, really made it easy. So I am the one who's using Skype, WhatsApp, Viber, Twitter, Facebook, and all other forms of media every day. And it is just a truly transformative moment in our lives, at least in mine, where it is communication is just so effortless. And I think it's LitFest X really deserves to be praised for putting technology right at the heart of the discourses between our two countries.
Thank you so much, Raza, and keep writing, and more power to you, and wish you all the success. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.